The mirror cracked down the middle, splitting Victoria Whitmore's reflection into two broken halves. She stared at the jagged line that now divided her face, wondering if this was God's way of showing her what she'd always known to be true. Even her own reflection couldn't bear to stay whole when looking back at her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria, get down here this instant. Her stepmother's shrill voice pierced through the thin walls of the Boston boarding house like a rusty nail through wood. Victoria pressed her palms against the washstand, steadying herself as the familiar knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She knew that tone. It meant another suitor had fled, another marriage prospect had crumbled, another humiliation awaited her downstairs. At 26, Victoria had become Boston's most notorious spinster. Not because she was difficult or unmarriageable, but because of what people whispered behind gloved hands at social gatherings. Too tall, too plain, too serious, too intelligent for her own good. Her stepmother, Constance Whitmore, had paraded her before every eligible bachelor from Beacon Hill to the Harbor District, and each one had found her wanting. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It was the look that crossed their faces. When they first saw her, that barely concealed disappointment, as if they'd ordered roast beef and been served day-old bread instead. Victoria had grown accustomed to seeing herself through their eyes, a woman of unremarkable brown hair that refused to hold curls, gray eyes too large for her angular face, and a height that made her tower over most men. At 5 feet 8 inches, she felt like a giraffe among gazelles in every drawing room she entered. Victoria Whitmore, if you don't come down here immediately, I'll drag you down myself. Constance's voice had reached its highest register, the one that made the windows rattle and the neighbors complain. Victoria straightened her shoulders and smoothed her plain brown dress, one of only 3 she owned, all of them practical and unflattering. Constance had long since stopped investing in beautiful gowns for her stepdaughter, declaring it throwing good money after bad. Instead, she saved the finest fabrics and latest fashions for her own daughter, Priscilla, who at 19 had already received 4 marriage proposals. The narrow staircase creaked under Victoria's feet as she descended to the boarding house's cramped parlor. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and desperation, furnished with threadbare velvet chairs and a sofa that had seen better decades. Constance stood by the window, her plump figure draped in emerald silk that had cost more than Victoria's entire wardrobe. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, the kind that came from having to explain why her stepdaughter was still unmarried. "Mr. Blackwood has decided not to pursue courtship," Constance announced without preamble, not bothering to soften the blow. "Apparently he found you too scholarly for his tastes. He wants a wife who can manage a household, not one who quotes Shakespeare at dinner." Victoria's cheeks burned. She had only mentioned Hamlet because Mr. Blackwood had been discussing Danish politics with such obvious ignorance that she couldn't help herself. "I was merely contributing to the conversation. You were showing off," Constance snapped. "No man wants a wife who makes him feel stupid, Victoria. When will you learn that your job is to make a man feel important, not to demonstrate your own intelligence?" The lecture continued, but Victoria's mind drifted to the familiar litany of her failures. Too tall, too smart, too serious, too plain. The words had been repeated so often they'd worn grooves in her soul like water over stone. She thought of her father, dead these past 8 years, who had encouraged her love of learning. He'd taught her to read Latin and Greek, to appreciate literature and philosophy, to think for herself. After his death, those qualities had become liabilities rather than assets. "Are you even listening to me?" Constance's voice cracked like a whip, bringing Victoria back to the present. "This is serious, Victoria. You're 26 years old. In 2 more years you'll be completely unmarriageable. And what then? I certainly can't support you forever." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Victoria knew Constance's patience was wearing thin. The woman had taken her in after her father's death out of obligation, not love, and that obligation had limits. Priscilla would marry soon, leaving home with a generous dowry. Victoria would become nothing but a burden, an old maid dependent on charity. Perhaps, Constance continued, her voice taking on a calculating tone, it's time we considered more practical alternatives. Victoria's blood chilled. She knew that tone, had heard it when Constance discussed investments and business deals. What do you mean? Constance moved to the writing desk and retrieved a newspaper, folded to reveal a particular column. These. She pointed to a section titled Matrimonial Advertisements. Victoria's eyes scanned the small print, each entry more desperate than the last. Widowers seeking housekeepers. Farmers needing wives. Miners looking for companions. You can't be serious, Victoria whispered. Dead serious. Constance's eyes glittered with the cold efficiency she brought to all unpleasant tasks. Mr. Pemberton at the bank mentioned that his clerk has a brother in Colorado Territory. A rancher, quite successful, looking for an educated wife. Someone who can help with correspondence and bookkeeping. Victoria's hands trembled as she held the newspaper. The very idea of becoming a mail-order bride filled her with horror. To travel hundreds of miles to marry a complete stranger, based on nothing but letters and promises. It seemed like the ultimate admission of failure, the final acknowledgement that she was so undesirable that no local man would have her. I won't do it, she said quietly. Constance's expression hardened. Then what exactly do you propose? You've frightened off every eligible bachelor in Boston. Your father left me with debts, not fortune. I've done my duty by you, Victoria, but my charity has limits. The words hit like physical blows. Victoria had always known she was a burden, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her feel as if the floor might give way beneath her feet. She thought of the small inheritance her father had left her, enough to survive for perhaps 6 months. If she lived frugally. After that, her options would be even more limited. Seamstress work for pennies, governess positions for families who might dismiss her for being too plain, or too educated, or worse. The rancher's name is Daniel Morrison, Constance continued, pressing her advantage. He owns 3,000 acres outside a town called Willowbrook. He's 32, never married, and specifically requested an educated woman who could help manage his business affairs. It's a perfect match for someone of your particular qualities. Victoria stared at the newspaper advertisement. Successful Colorado rancher, seek intelligent, educated wife for companionship and business partnership. Character and capability valued above conventional beauty. Correspondence welcomed. The words blurred as tears pricked her eyes. Even this stranger, this Daniel Morrison, felt the need to specify that he wasn't looking for conventional beauty. It was as if the entire world had agreed that Victoria fell short of any reasonable standard of attractiveness. I need time to think, Victoria said, her voice barely audible. Constance's smile was thin and victorious. Of course, dear. But don't take too long. Mr. Morrison won't wait forever. And opportunities like this don't come along often for women in your situation. That night, Victoria lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. The boarding house creaked and settled around her, filled with the sounds of other people's lives, muffled conversations, crying babies, the scratch of pen on paper as someone else, perhaps, wrote letters to distant strangers offering their hearts in exchange for security. She rose and lit a candle, then moved to the small writing desk squeezed into the corner of her room. Her father's books lined a makeshift shelf above it, volumes of poetry, philosophy, and literature that Constance had threatened to sell more than once. Victoria ran her fingers along their worn spines, remembering how her father had read to her on winter evenings, his voice bringing distant worlds to life. "What would you do, Papa?" she whispered to the darkness. The silence offered no answers, but memory did. She recalled her father's words from years ago when she'd cried about being too tall for the other children to like her. "Victoria, my dear," he'd said, "the right person will see your height as elegance, your intelligence as a gift, your seriousness as depth of character. Never make yourself smaller to fit someone else's limited vision." But her father had been a dreamer, an idealist who believed in love and literature more than practical realities. He died leaving her in the care of a woman who saw her as nothing but an inconvenience. In a world that judged women primarily on their ability to be ornamental, Victoria pulled out a sheet of writing paper and dipped her pen in ink. Her hand hovered over the blank page for long minutes. Was she really considering this? Trading one form of desperation for another? Exchanging the familiar misery of Boston for the unknown dangers of the frontier? She thought of Mr. Blackwood's dismissive sneer when she'd quoted Shakespeare, of the way Constance's friends whispered about poor Victoria when they thought she couldn't hear, of the future that stretched before her, years of growing older and more desperate, taking whatever work she could find, dependent on the grudging charity of relatives who saw her as a burden. At least in Colorado, she might find someone who valued her mind over her appearance, someone who saw her height as stately rather than ungainly, her intelligence as an asset rather than a flaw, someone who might actually want the person she was, rather than constantly trying to reshape her into someone else. The pen touched paper, and words began to flow. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I am writing in response to your advertisement seeking an educated wife. I am Victoria Whitmore, age 26, of Boston, Massachusetts. I have received extensive education in literature, languages, mathematics, and business. Correspondence. I am capable of managing household accounts and business affairs with accuracy and discretion. I must be honest with you, as honesty seems the only foundation upon which a successful partnership might be built. I am not what society considers conventionally beautiful. I am tall, plain-featured, and possessed of what many consider an excessive education for a woman. I have been told I am too serious, too intellectual, and too outspoken for most men's preferences. However, I am also hardworking, reliable, and capable of great loyalty to those who earn it. I can cook, clean, manage finances, and conduct business correspondence. I have read extensively and can discuss topics beyond household management, should you find such conversation agreeable rather than tiresome." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If these qualities seem suitable to your needs, I would welcome correspondence to determine if we might find compatibility. I ask only for honesty in return, as false expectations serve no one well. Respectfully yours, Victoria Whitmore. She sealed the letter before she could lose her nerve, addressing it to Daniel Morrison, Willowbrook, Colorado Territory. Tomorrow she would post it and begin the terrifying process of potentially changing her entire life based on the words of a stranger and her own desperate hope that somewhere in the vast American frontier, there might be a place for someone like her. As dawn broke over Boston's gray skyline, Victoria made her decision. She would not spend the rest of her life apologizing for who she was, or trying to squeeze herself into the narrow mold society had prepared for women like her. If Daniel Morrison proved to be another disappointment, at least she would have tried. At least she would have chosen her own path rather than simply accepting the one chosen for her. The breaking point had become a turning point, though she didn't yet know that her letter would change not only her life, but the life of a lonely rancher who had given up hope of finding someone who could see past his own perceived inadequacies to the heart beneath. 3 weeks after posting her letter, Victoria stood at her bedroom window watching the morning fog roll off Boston Harbor. The familiar gray mist that had once seemed romantic now felt suffocating, pressing against the glass like the weight of her unchanged circumstances. Each day without a response from Daniel Morrison felt like another confirmation that even desperate men in distant territories found her lacking. The boarding house bustled with its usual morning chaos. Mrs. Henley, the landlady, shouted at her teenage son for tracking mud through the hallway. Mr. Patterson from the second floor argued with his wife about money again, their voices carrying through the thin walls. Victoria had memorized the sounds of other people's lives, cataloged them like specimens in a naturalist's collection. She wondered if this was all her life would ever be, observing from the sidelines while real living happened to other people. A sharp knock interrupted her melancholy. "Victoria!" Constance's voice carried its usual edge of impatience. "There's post for you." Victoria's heart lurched. She opened the door to find Constance holding a thick envelope, her expression curious and calculating. The return address read, D. Morrison, Willowbrook, Colorado Territory, in bold, confident handwriting. "Well?" Constance demanded. "Aren't you going to open it?" Victoria's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. The letter was written on good quality paper, the script neat and deliberate. She read silently, aware of Constance hovering like a vulture waiting for news. "Dear Miss Whitmore, your letter arrived as a welcome surprise. I had received numerous responses to my advertisement, but yours was the first to demonstrate both intelligence and refreshing honesty. Too many correspondents seemed more interested in my financial circumstances than in building a genuine partnership. I must return your candor with my own. I am not what most would consider handsome. A childhood accident left me with a permanent limp and scars on my left arm and shoulder. I am also what society might term rough around the edges, having spent more time with cattle and horses than in drawing rooms. My education, while practical, lacks the formal refinement you possess. However, I have built a successful ranch through hard work and determination. My property spans 3,000 acres of some of Colorado's finest grazing land, with a main house that, while comfortable, could benefit from a woman's touch. I employ 12 men year-round and need someone capable of managing the business correspondence, bookkeeping, and household affairs while I focus on the ranching operations. More importantly, I find myself lonely. At 32, I have spent so many years building my future that I have neglected to find someone to share it with. Your letter suggests a woman of substance who values partnership over prettiness, intelligence over idle charm. If you are willing, I would like to continue our correspondence with the aim of determining our compatibility. Should we find ourselves suited, I would be honored to send money for your travel expenses to Willowbrook. I ask only that you come with an open mind and the understanding that frontier life requires adaptability and courage. Have enclosed a photograph and a more detailed description of Willowbrook and my circumstances. I hope you will find them acceptable. With sincere regards, Daniel Morrison." Victoria's breath caught as she unfolded the photograph. The man looking back at her had dark hair and serious eyes, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the Colorado sun. He stood beside a magnificent horse, his left shoulder slightly lower than his right, but his bearing proud and confident. He was not conventionally handsome, but there was something compelling about his direct gaze and strong jaw. "Well," Constance demanded again, "what does he say?" Victoria refolded the letter carefully. "He's interested in continuing correspondence." Constance's eyes gleamed. "Excellent. When will you leave for Colorado?" "I haven't agreed to anything yet," Victoria said, though her heart was already racing with possibilities. This is just the beginning of getting acquainted. But as she read Daniel's letter again in the privacy of her room, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Here was a man who had responded thoughtfully to her honesty, who seemed to value the very qualities that Boston society found objectionable. He hadn't dismissed her concerns about her appearance or education. Instead, he had shared his own perceived inadequacies with equal frankness. Over the following weeks, Their correspondence blossomed into something approaching friendship. Daniel wrote about his daily life on the ranch, the challenges of raising cattle on the frontier, his dreams of expanding his operations. He described Willowbrook as a growing town with a school, 2 churches, a general store, and even a small library. He asked thoughtful questions about her education and opinions on various subjects, treating her intelligence as an asset rather than an embarrassment. Victoria found herself looking forward to his letters with an anticipation that surprised her. She wrote back with equal openness, describing her love of literature, her frustration with society's limitations on women, her dreams of a life where she could contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and understood. The turning point came 6 weeks later, when Daniel sent not just a letter but a bank draft for travel expenses and a proposal that took her breath away. Dear Victoria, I hope I may use your given name, as our correspondence has progressed beyond formal acquaintance. Your letters have brought light to my evenings and wisdom to my thoughts. I find myself eagerly awaiting each post, treasuring your insights on everything from Shakespeare to cattle breeding. Your suggestions about record keeping were particularly astute. I believe we have reached a juncture where continued correspondence alone cannot answer the questions in both our hearts. I would like to invite you to Willowbrook as my guest, with no obligations beyond getting to know each other in person. I have arranged for you to stay with Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, a respectable widow who runs the town's boarding house. She is expecting you and will ensure your comfort and reputation remain intact. The enclosed bank draft covers your train fare and any necessary expenses. If, after a reasonable period of acquaintance, we find ourselves unsuited, I will provide return passage to Boston with no questions asked. If, however, we discover the compatibility our letters suggest, I would be honored to make you my wife. I must warn you that Willowbrook is not Boston. Life here is simpler but more demanding. The winters are harsh, the summers challenging, and civilized society is still a work in progress. But there is a freedom here that the East cannot offer, a chance to build something meaningful from nothing. I await your answer with hope and trepidation. Your devoted correspondent, Daniel. Victoria stared at the bank draft, more money than she had seen in months. The weight of decision pressed down on her like a physical force. This was the moment of truth, the point where her correspondence with a stranger became a real choice that would reshape her entire life. She found Constance in the parlor, going over household accounts with her characteristic frown of concentration. I've received another letter from Mr. Morrison, Victoria announced. Constance looked up immediately. And he's invited me to Colorado to meet in person. Constance's face lit up with unmistakable relief. Wonderful. When do you leave? I haven't decided to go. What's to decide? Constance's voice sharpened. The man is offering you marriage, Victoria. A successful rancher with his own land. Do you think better opportunities are waiting around the corner? Victoria sank into the threadbare armchair across from her stepmother. It's terrifying, Constance. Traveling 1,000 miles to meet a stranger, possibly to marry him. What if we don't suit? What if he takes one look at me and changes his mind? Then you'll come home, Constance said practically. But Victoria, what is your alternative? To stay here, growing older and more unmarriageable every day? To depend on my charity indefinitely while Priscilla marries and starts her own family? The truth in those words stung because Victoria had been thinking the same thoughts. At 26, her options were indeed limited and shrinking daily. But the leap from exchanging letters with Daniel Morrison to actually traveling to Colorado felt enormous, fraught with dangers she could barely imagine. That evening, Victoria walked to the harbor as she often did when her thoughts were troubled. The salt air cleared her head, and the sight of ships departing for distant ports always stirred something restless in her soul. Tonight, she watched a clipper ship disappear into the darkness beyond the harbor lights. carrying passengers toward unknown adventures and new lives. A memory surfaced of her father reading her stories about brave women who chose their own destinies, heroines who left familiar shores for uncharted territories, who risked everything for the chance at something better. As a child, she had dreamed of being like them. When had she become so frightened of the very adventures she had once imagined? Standing there in the salty wind, Victoria made her decision. She would go to Colorado. Not because she was desperate, not because Constance wanted her gone, but because Daniel Morrison's letters had awakened something in her that had been dormant too long, the courage to believe she might be worthy of love and partnership. Following morning, she composed her response. Dear Daniel, your generous invitation both thrills and terrifies me, which I believe is exactly how the most important decisions should feel. After much consideration, I have decided to accept your invitation to visit Willowbrook. I confess to considerable nervousness about this undertaking. I have never traveled beyond Massachusetts, never stayed in a place where I knew no one, never made a decision quite so momentous. But your letters have convinced me that you are a man of honor who will treat me with respect, regardless of our ultimate compatibility. I will depart Boston on the morning train 3 weeks hence, which should put me in Willowbrook on the 15th of October. I will send a telegram with my exact arrival time as the date approaches. I come with no expectations beyond honest acquaintance, and the hope that we might find in person what we seem to have discovered in our correspondence. I promise to approach our meeting with the same openness and directness that has marked our letters. Until we meet, Victoria. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria purchased a few simple traveling dresses with her remaining savings, packed her father's books, and endured Constance's endless advice about how to catch and keep a frontier husband. Priscilla, surprisingly, seemed genuinely sad to see her go, admitting that she would miss their late-night conversations about books and dreams. The night before her departure, Victoria sat in her small room, surrounded by her few possessions. Everything she owned in the world fit into 2 modest trunks. It seemed like such a small collection to represent 26 years of life, but perhaps that was appropriate. She was leaving behind not just her belongings, but her old self, the timid, defeated woman who had accepted other people's assessments of her worth. As the train whistle echoed through the morning air, announcing departures to places with names like Chicago, Denver, and points west, Victoria felt a thrill of anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. For the first time in years, she was moving toward something rather than simply enduring what she had. Whatever awaited her in Willowbrook, it would be her choice, her adventure, her chance to discover who she might become when freed from the constraints of other people's limited expectations. The leap of faith had begun. Victoria woke to the sound of children's laughter drifting through her window. The morning sun cast golden rectangles across the floor of her small room, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back, the disastrous meeting with Daniel, Marcus Blackwood's cruel words, the crushing realization that she had exchanged one form of rejection for another. She dressed mechanically in her plainest dress and made her way. Downstairs to the boarding house dining room, Mrs. Jenkins was serving breakfast to a handful of boarders, traveling salesmen, and temporary workers who barely glanced up from their plates. Victoria took a seat at the far end of the long table, hoping to avoid conversation. "You're up early for someone who had such a trying evening," Mrs. Jenkins observed, setting down a plate of eggs and biscuits that Victoria had no appetite for. "I couldn't sleep," Victoria admitted. Daniel looked none too happy when he left last night either. Mrs. Jenkins continued with the directness Victoria was learning was typical of frontier people. Marcus Blackwood been stirring up trouble again. Victoria's cheeks burned. "News travels quickly here. Honey, this town's got maybe 200 souls left in it. A sneeze on one end gets heard on the other." Mrs. Jenkins poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Victoria. Marcus Blackwood's been circling Daniel's ranch like a vulture for months, waiting for him to fail so he can buy it cheap. Having you arrive just gives him fresh ammunition. I don't understand. Marcus owns half the county, but he's never been satisfied with half of anything. Daniel's got the best water rights in the valley, and Marcus wants them. Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward conspiratorially. He's been spreading stories about Daniel being too proud to accept help, too stubborn to sell out like the smart folks did when the mine closed. Victoria pushed her eggs around her plate. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps I should return to Boston before I make things worse for Mr. Morrison. Now that would be exactly what Marcus wants, came a new voice from the doorway. Victoria looked up to see a young woman about her own age entering the dining room. She had auburn hair pinned up practical style and wore a simple blue dress that somehow managed to look both modest and becoming. Forgive me for eavesdropping, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Anna Mitchell, the schoolteacher. Victoria's interest sparked immediately. You teach here in Willowbrook? What's left of it, Anna said with a wry smile, taking a seat beside Victoria. We're down to 8 students since the mine closed, but those 8 deserve an education just as much as the 40 we had last year. Mrs. Jenkins poured Anna a cup of coffee. Anna here's been fighting tooth and nail to keep the school open. The town council keeps threatening to close it down. Not while I have breath in my body, Anna said firmly. Then she turned to Victoria with curious eyes. I heard you're educated. What did you study back east? For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, Victoria felt a spark of genuine interest from someone. Literature, languages, mathematics, natural philosophy. I was particularly fond of Latin and Greek classics. Anna's face lit up. Latin. I've been trying to teach myself so I could offer it to my older students, but I'm afraid I'm making a hash of it. Would you ... That is, would you consider helping me? I can't pay much. But I would love to, Victoria said quickly, then caught herself. That is, if I remain in Willowbrook long enough. Why wouldn't you? Anna asked with the directness Victoria was learning was common here. Victoria hesitated, then decided honesty had served her better than pretense so far. Mr. Morrison and I discovered last evening that we may not be as well suited as our correspondence suggested. Anna studied her with intelligent brown eyes. You mean Marcus Blackwood stuck his nose where it doesn't belong and made you both feel about 2 inches tall? Something like that. Marcus Blackwood is a snake, Anna said flatly. He's been trying to run every decent person out of this valley for years. Don't let him succeed. Mrs. Jenkins nodded agreement. That man's got more money than sense and more pride than either. He thinks he can buy or bully his way to anything he wants. But surely if Mr. Morrison's ranch is failing. Victoria began. Who told you that? Anna interrupted. Marcus? Because Daniel Morrison runs the most efficient operation in the county. His problems aren't with ranching. They're with transportation and markets. Same problems everyone's having since the railroad started favoring the bigger shipping points. Victoria felt a flicker of hope. You mean he wasn't being entirely truthful about his circumstances? Men have a way of making their troubles sound bigger than they are when they're feeling sorry for themselves, Mrs. Jenkins said with the wisdom of long experience. Just like they make their successes sound bigger when they're trying to impress someone. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of horses and raised voices. Anna peered out the window and frowned. That's Daniel's wagon, but he's got someone with him, looks like. Her expression brightened. Oh, it's Miguel and his family. Victoria followed Anna outside, where she saw Daniel helping a young woman and 2 small children down from his wagon. The woman appeared to be in considerable distress, and the children clung to her skirts with wide, frightened eyes. What's happened? Anna asked, hurrying over. Daniel's face was grim. Their cabin burned down last night. Lightning strike. They've lost everything. The young woman, Miguel's wife, Victoria assumed, began speaking rapidly in Spanish, tears streaming down her face. Daniel responded in the same language, his voice gentle and reassuring. Victoria was surprised by his fluency. It was another skill he hadn't mentioned in his letters. Maria says they have nowhere to go, Daniel explained to Ana. Miguel's been working for me for 3 years, but the bunkhouse is full, and they can't all crowd in there with the single men. Ana bit her lip, clearly thinking hard. Mrs. Patterson's old place has been empty since she moved back east. It needs work, but it's got a roof and walls. I don't have the money to pay rent for them, Daniel said quietly. Things are tight. Enough as they are. This was Victoria's moment. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward. I do. Everyone turned to stare at her. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks but pressed on. I have some money left from my travel funds. Not much, but enough to help with immediate expenses. Daniel's expression was unreadable. Victoria, you don't understand the situation here. This isn't your responsibility. Perhaps not, Victoria said, lifting her chin in a gesture her father would have recognized. But I understand what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn. If I can assist this family, I want to. Maria looked between them with confusion, clearly not understanding the English conversation. Victoria surprised everyone, including herself, by addressing the woman directly in Spanish. Esta usted herida, los niños están bien. Maria's face broke into a grateful smile. Habla español. Sí, estamos bien, pero hemos perdido todo. As Victoria continued speaking with Maria in fluent Spanish, she became aware of the amazed looks on everyone's faces. Daniel stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Where did you learn Spanish? He asked. My father believed in the importance of languages, Victoria replied. I also speak French and Italian, and I can read Latin and Greek. She turned back to Maria. Tell me what you need most urgently. Over the next hour, Victoria found herself organizing relief efforts with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself. She sent Anna to gather women from the church to collect clothing and household items. She convinced Mrs. Jenkins to prepare a hot meal for the family. She even managed to persuade the owner of the general store to extend credit for immediate necessities, using her own funds as guarantee. You're remarkable, Anna said as they worked together sorting donated clothing. I've never seen anyone take charge of a crisis so efficiently. I spent years helping my father with his parish work, Victoria explained. He always said that education without compassion was just intellectual vanity. As the day progressed, Victoria noticed a change in how the townspeople looked at her. Where before they had seen only a tall, plain Eastern spinster, they now saw someone who could take action when action was needed. Even some of the men who had stared at her with suspicious curiosity the evening before now nodded respectfully when they passed. Daniel worked alongside her throughout the day, and Victoria caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When they finally got the family settled in the cleaned and furnished cottage, he asked to speak with her privately. I owe you an apology, he said as they stood outside Mrs. Patterson's former home. I misjudged you yesterday. I let Marcus Blackwood's poison and my own self-doubt cloud my thinking. We both let circumstances affect our judgment, Victoria replied. I said things I shouldn't have. No, you were right to call me out on misrepresenting my situation. I was so afraid you'd reject me if you knew the truth that I made things sound better than they are. He ran a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of frustration. The truth is, I'm not failing, but I'm not thriving either. I'm holding my own, but barely. Victoria looked at the cottage where Maria was getting her children settled for the night. Sometimes holding your own is enough. Sometimes it's everything. You were magnificent today, Daniel said quietly. The way you took charge, the way you spoke with Maria in her own language, the way you organized everyone to help. I've never seen anything like it. I felt useful, Victoria admitted. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. You do matter, Daniel said, and something in his voice made her look up at him. I realized today that I've been thinking about this all wrong. I was so focused on what I thought I could offer you, or what you might think of my circumstances, that I forgot the most important question, which is what we might accomplish together. His blue eyes held hers steadily. Today I saw a woman who could be a true partner. Not just someone to keep house and manage correspondence, but someone who could help build something meaningful. Someone who could make a real difference in this community. Victoria felt something warm unfold in her chest, a sensation she hardly dared to name. I felt that too. For the first time since I arrived, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Stay, Daniel said simply. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this place needs you. Because he paused, then continued with quiet intensity. Because I think we could build something good together. Something neither of us could manage alone. As if summoned by their conversation, Anna appeared at the cottage door. Victoria, Maria wants to thank you properly. She's made coffee, and the children want to show you their drawings. Victoria looked between Daniel and Anna, two people who had seen past her plainness to recognize her worth. For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, she felt a flicker of the belonging she had always craved. I'd like that, she said, and realized she was talking about more than just coffee and children's drawings. She was talking about staying, about building, about belonging to something larger than her own loneliness. As they walked toward the cottage together, Victoria caught sight of Marcus Blackwood riding past on his fine horse. He slowed to observe the scene. Daniel and Victoria walking companionably together, the warm light spilling from the cottage windows, the sense of community and purpose that surrounded the little house. His expression was dark with frustrated anger. His cruel words the night before had been meant to drive Victoria away and further isolate Daniel. Instead, they had pushed two wounded people together and revealed strengths neither had known they possessed. For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, Victoria smiled with genuine happiness. Perhaps she was exactly where she was meant to be after all. 3 weeks had passed since the fire that changed everything. Victoria now spent her mornings helping Anna at the schoolhouse, teaching Latin to the older children and assisting with mathematics. Her afternoons were devoted to managing Daniel's correspondence and bookkeeping, work that had revealed just how precarious his financial situation truly was. The ranch was profitable, but barely, and one bad season could destroy everything he'd built. What surprised Victoria most was how naturally she and Daniel had fallen into partnership. Their evening conversations over dinner had evolved from polite exchanges to passionate discussions about ranch management, education reform, and the future of Willowbrook. She found herself looking forward to these talks with an anticipation that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine, intellectual connection. But their growing closeness hadn't gone unnoticed. Marcus Blackwood's hostility had intensified, and Victoria sensed something brewing beneath the surface of the town's fragile peace. The storm broke on a gray November morning when Anna burst into the schoolhouse where Victoria was tutoring Tommy Henderson in Latin conjugations. They're going to close the school, Anna announced without preamble, her face flushed with anger and exertion. Victoria looked up from Tommy's slate. What? Who decided that? Emergency town council meeting last night, Marcus called it, claiming the town can't afford to pay my salary anymore. Anna's voice shook with fury. He's convinced them that with only 8 students, the school is a luxury Willowbrook can't afford. Tommy, a bright 10-year-old whose father worked for Daniel, looked stricken. But Miss Mitchell, who's going to teach us? My pa says I need learning if I'm ever going to amount to anything. Victoria placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder while her mind raced. When does this take effect? End of the month. 2 weeks. Anna slumped into her chair. I don't know what I'll do. Teaching is all I know, and there are no other positions within 100 miles. There has to be something we can do, Victoria said firmly. Appeal to the Territorial Education Board. Petition the remaining families. Marcus owns half the businesses left in town, Anna interrupted. Anyone who opposes him risks losing their livelihood. And the families who remain are barely scraping. By themselves, they can't afford to pay for private education. Victoria felt a familiar surge of the righteous anger that had gotten her into trouble so many times in Boston. This is about more than money, isn't it? This is Marcus trying to drive out anyone who might oppose his control over the valley. Anna nodded grimly. He wants Daniel's land, and he knows that as long as there are people here willing to fight for this community, Daniel won't give up. Close the school, drive out the families with children, and eventually Daniel will have no choice but to sell. That evening, Victoria discussed the situation with Daniel over dinner at the ranch. She'd been taking most of her meals there, arrangement that felt increasingly natural despite the impropriety it might suggest to outside observers. I heard about the school, Daniel said, his expression grim. Marcus is getting bolder. There must be something we can do, Victoria insisted. Those children deserve an education. Daniel pushed food around his plate without eating. Victoria, I wish there was, but I'm barely keeping this place running as it is. I can't afford to take on the school's expenses, and Marcus knows it. What if we didn't need town funding? Victoria said suddenly, an idea forming. What if we could make the school self-sustaining? Daniel looked up with interest. How? Victoria's excitement grew as the plan took shape in her mind. A boarding school. There are families throughout the territory who want education for their children, but can't access it. We could take in students from ranches and small towns within a 100-mile radius. Charge tuition that covers not just education but room and board. That's ambitious, Daniel said slowly. It would require significant investment. Expanded facilities, additional teachers, supplies. Quotes. I have some money, Victoria said. Not much, but enough to start small. And Anna could recruit teachers from back east, educated women, who might welcome the opportunity for adventure and independence. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. It could work, he admitted finally. But Victoria, if we fail, if this investment doesn't pay off, I could lose everything, and you could lose what little security you have. And if we do nothing, Marcus wins, Victoria replied. The school closes, Anna leaves, families move away, and eventually, he gets your ranch anyway. At least this way we're fighting back. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. Daniel rose and peered out the window, his face darkening. It's Sheriff Cooper, and he's got a posse with him. They went outside to meet the riders. Sheriff Cooper, a fair-minded man in his 50s, dismounted with obvious reluctance. Behind him were Marcus Blackwood and 4 of his ranch hands, all armed. Daniel, Sheriff Cooper said formally, I'm afraid I have to ask you some questions about the cattle that went missing from the Blackwood spread. Victoria felt Daniel stiffen beside her. What cattle? Marcus urged his horse forward, his face a mask of righteous anger. 20 head of my prime breeding stock disappeared 3 nights ago. My men tracked them to the edge of your property. That's impossible, Daniel said flatly. I haven't moved any cattle for 2 weeks, and all my stock is accounted for. Then, you won't mind if we search your property, Marcus said smoothly, just to clear up any misunderstanding. Sheriff Cooper looked uncomfortable. Daniel, I know you're an honest man, but Marcus has witnesses who say they saw riders moving cattle toward your land. I have to investigate. Victoria watched the exchange with growing unease. Something about Marcus's confidence, the timing of this accusation, felt orchestrated. But before she could voice her concerns, Daniel was already agreeing to the search. Search all you want, he said. But when you don't find anything, I want a public apology. The search took 2 hours. Victoria stayed close to Daniel, noting how Marcus's men seemed to know exactly where to look, as if they'd scouted the property beforehand. When they reached the north pasture, near the boundary with the national forest, one of Blackwood's hands suddenly called out, "Found something." The man was standing near a grove of aspen trees, pointing at the ground. "Fresh tracks leading this way, and look here, Blackwood brand on this tree bark." Sheriff Cooper examined the evidence while Marcus watched with barely concealed satisfaction. "Looks like cattle were driven through here recently," the sheriff admitted. "And this bark does show a brand mark." "Those tracks could belong to anyone," Victoria said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "And anyone could have marked that tree." Marcus turned his cold gaze on her. "Are you suggesting I planted evidence, Miss Whitmore?" "I'm suggesting that cattle thieves wouldn't be stupid enough to drive stolen stock across their own property." "In broad daylight," Victoria replied, meeting his stare without flinching. "Victoria," Daniel warned quietly, but she ignored him. "Furthermore," she continued, "if cattle had been held here for 3 days, there would be signs, trampled grass, droppings, damaged vegetation. I see none of that." Marcus's face darkened. "Sheriff, are you going to listen to the accusations of a desperate spinster, or are you going to follow the evidence?" "The evidence is circumstantial at best," Victoria shot back. "And your eagerness to find it suspicious. Enough!" Sheriff Cooper's voice cut through the growing tension. "Daniel, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me for questioning. Just until we can sort this out." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. This was Marcus's real plan, not to prove Daniel guilty, but to create enough suspicion and scandal to destroy his reputation. In a community already struggling to survive, trust was everything. A rancher accused of cattle theft, even if eventually cleared, would find it nearly impossible to conduct business. "This is a setup," Victoria said desperately. "Sheriff, surely you can see that Mr. Blackwood has motives beyond justice here. He's been trying to buy Mr. Morrison's land for months." "That's a serious accusation, Miss Whitmore," Sheriff Cooper said gravely. "Do you have proof?" Victoria's heart sank. Of course. She had no proof. Marcus was too clever to leave evidence of his schemes. "No direct proof, but then I suggest you keep your theories to yourself," Marcus interrupted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "before you find yourself facing charges of slander." As Daniel was led away, Victoria felt a fury unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This was injustice of the most calculated kind, the abuse of power by someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. She thought of all the times in Boston when she'd bitten her tongue, accepted unfair treatment, allowed others to define her worth. Not anymore. "This isn't over," she called after Marcus as he remounted his horse. He paused and looked back at her with amusement. "Miss Whitmore, I think you'll find it very much is over. Without Daniel, this ranch will fail within months. The school will close, your friends will scatter, and you'll be forced to return east with your tail between your legs. Perhaps this time you'll learn to accept your proper place in the world." After the posse left, Victoria stood alone in the gathering darkness, her mind racing. She had perhaps days before Daniel's reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The school closure would proceed as planned, Anna would be forced to leave, and Marcus would ultimately get everything he wanted. But Victoria had spent her entire life being underestimated by men like Marcus Blackwood. Men who saw only a tall, plain woman and assumed she was powerless. They had never faced someone who had been forged by years of rejection into something harder and more determined than they could imagine. She thought of her father's words about fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. She thought of the children who would lose their education, the families who would be driven from their homes, the good man sitting in jail on false charges. Marcus Blackwood had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that destroying Daniel would destroy her spirit. Instead, it had freed her from any remaining hesitation about fighting back with everything she had. Walking back toward the ranch house, Victoria began to plan. She had 48 hours before Daniel's hearing. 48 hours to prove his innocence and expose Marcus's schemes. It seemed impossible, but Victoria had discovered something about herself during her time in Willowbrook. When pushed to her breaking point, she didn't break. She became dangerous. The crucible moment had arrived, and Victoria intended to emerge from it transformed, not into the compliant woman society expected, but into the force of nature she was meant to be. Victoria had never broken into a building before, but desperation had a way of teaching new skills quickly. The Blackwood Ranch office sat dark and silent in the pre-dawn hours, its windows reflecting the stars like watchful eyes. She crouched behind a water barrel, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire ranch. 20-4 hours had passed since Daniel's arrest. The hearing was scheduled for this afternoon, and Victoria had spent every waking moment gathering evidence to prove his innocence. What she'd discovered had shaken her to the core. Marcus Blackwood's schemes went far deeper than simple land grabbing. Anna had helped, using her connections with other teachers throughout the territory to gather information. Miguel had contributed his knowledge of local ranch hands and their loyalties. Even Mrs. Jenkins had proved valuable, revealing gossip from traveling salesmen about Blackwood's business dealings in other counties. The picture that emerged was of a man who had systematically destroyed competitors through false accusations, planted evidence, and bribery. Daniel wasn't his first victim, just his most important one. But Victoria needed proof, and that proof was locked inside the office building where Marcus conducted his business affairs. She'd observed his routine for the past day, noting that he kept a safe behind his desk and that the night watchman made rounds every 2 hours. The window latch gave way with a soft click. Apparently Marcus's confidence in his own power had made him careless about security. Victoria slipped inside, her soft shoes silent on the wooden floor. The office smelled of leather, tobacco, and the particular mustiness of old money. She lit a small candle and began her search, working methodically through filing cabinets and desk drawers. Most of the documents were routine business correspondence. But in the bottom drawer of Marcus's desk, she found a folder marked Land Acquisitions that made her blood run cold. Inside were detailed maps showing not just Daniel's ranch, but every property within 50 miles of Willowbrook. Each was marked with notes about the owner's financial situations, family circumstances, and potential vulnerabilities. Victoria's hands trembled as she read Marcus's cold assessments of how to best destroy each family's livelihood. The Morrison ranch was marked with particular attention. Water rights essential for territorial expansion, one note read. Recommend isolation tactics followed by financial pressure. Cattle theft accusation if necessary. Victoria felt sick. This wasn't just about business. It was about the systematic destruction of an entire community for one man's profit. But the folder also contained something else. Correspondence with cattle buyers in Denver, documenting sales of livestock that didn't match the numbers Marcus claimed to own. She was photographing the documents with a small camera Anna had borrowed from the traveling photographer when she heard footsteps on the porch outside. Victoria blew out her candle and pressed herself against the wall behind the door, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. The door opened and Marcus entered, carrying a lamp. He moved to his desk without noticing the displaced papers, settling into his chair with the confidence of a man reviewing his approaching victory. He opened the safe and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, spreading it across his desk. From her hiding place, Victoria could see him making entries in the book. Even from a distance, she recognized what he was doing, falsifying records to cover the sale of cattle he'd claimed were stolen. The very cattle he'd accused Daniel of taking. She waited in agonizing silence until Marcus finished his work and left the office. Then she crept forward and photographed the ledger pages, her hands shaking so badly she feared the images would be blurred. But when she examined them later, she could clearly see the fabricated entries that would destroy Marcus's entire case. As dawn broke over Willowbrook, Victoria raced back to town with evidence that would not only clear Daniel, but expose Marcus as the criminal he truly was. But she knew presenting the evidence would be dangerous. Marcus had too much influence, too many people in his pocket. She needed allies, and she needed them before the hearing began. Her first stop was the Telegraph office. Using her own funds, she sent urgent messages to territorial officials in Denver, ranch associations throughout Colorado, and even newspaper editors who might be interested in a story about corruption in the territories. If Marcus wanted to play with power and influence, Victoria would show him what real power looked like when wielded by someone with nothing left to lose. Next, she sought out every family in Willowbrook whose children attended the school. Many were reluctant to get involved, fearing Marcus's retaliation. But Victoria's passionate arguments about their children's futures slowly won them over. By mid-morning, she had commitments from 6 families to speak at the hearing about Marcus's intimidation tactics. Anna proved invaluable, using her position as teacher to rally the women of the community. Men might fear economic retaliation, she told Victoria, but mothers defending their children's education are a force unto themselves. As the hour of the hearing approached, Victoria made her way to the courthouse, a hastily converted store building that served multiple civic functions. Word had spread through the community, and the small space was packed with residents Victoria had never seen take interest in local politics. Daniel sat in the front row, flanked by Sheriff Cooper. When he saw Victoria enter, his face lit with surprise and concern. She'd told no one of her plan, knowing that involving others in potential criminal activity would be unfair. But now, seeing his worried expression, she felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. Judge Hammond, a visiting territorial official who traveled between small communities, called the proceedings to order. Marcus rose to present his case with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to winning. "Your Honor," he began, "the evidence clearly shows that Daniel Morrison allowed stolen cattle to be driven across his property. Whether through negligence or active participation, he bears responsibility for this crime." Marcus's presentation was smooth and convincing. He called witnesses who testified about finding tracks and brand marks, produced maps showing the supposed route of the stolen cattle, and painted a picture of Daniel as a desperate man driven to crime by financial pressures. Sheriff Cooper presented the physical evidence, photographs of the tracks, bark scrapings showing the Blackwood brand, testimony about Daniel's declining business prospects. It was a carefully constructed case that would have convinced Victoria herself if she hadn't known the truth. When Marcus finished, Judge Hammond turned to Daniel. "Mr. Morrison, how do you respond to these charges?" Daniel rose slowly, his dignity intact despite his circumstances. "Your Honor, I can only say that I am innocent of these charges. I have never stolen cattle from Mr. Blackwood or anyone else. I believe this accusation is motivated by his desire to acquire my land, but I have no proof of such a conspiracy." "Then you offer no defense beyond your word?" Judge Hammond asked. "I offer my word as a man who has lived honestly in this community for 8 years, Daniel replied quietly. "If that is not sufficient, then I accept whatever judgment this court deems appropriate." Victoria felt her heart break at the resignation in his voice. Daniel had been so ground down by circumstances that he was prepared to accept defeat rather than fight accusations he couldn't prove false. But she had not come this far to watch a good man destroyed by a criminal's lies. She rose from her seat. In the gallery. "Your Honor, I request permission to speak on Mr. Morrison's behalf." Judge Hammond looked surprised. "Are you an attorney, Miss Whitmore?" "Your Honor, Victoria Whitmore. I am not an attorney, but I have evidence that directly bears on this case." Marcus turned to stare at her, his face darkening with anger. "Your Honor, this woman has no standing in these proceedings. She's merely the defendant's." He paused, clearly searching for a suitably dismissive term. Companion. "She's his intended bride," Anna called out from the gallery, "and a woman of impeccable character who has done more for this community in 6 weeks than Mr. Blackwood has in 6 years. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Victoria felt a surge of strength from the unexpected support. "Your Honor, I have evidence that these charges are not only false but part of a deliberate conspiracy to defraud this community." Judge Hammond studied her with interest. "This is highly irregular, but I'll allow you to present your evidence. The court is interested in truth, regardless of its source." Victoria walked to the front of the courtroom, every eye upon her. In this moment, she felt the full weight of her transformation from the cowering woman who had arrived in Willowbrook. She was no longer hiding behind her hair, no longer apologizing for her height or intelligence. She stood straight and tall, meeting Marcus's furious gaze with calm determination. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong. "3 nights ago I visited Mr. Blackwood's ranch office and discovered evidence that proves Mr. Morrison's innocence beyond any doubt." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Marcus shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this woman is confessing to breaking and entering. Her testimony is inadmissible." "I am confessing to trespassing in service of justice," Victoria corrected, pulling out the photographs she'd taken. "And these documents prove that Mr. Blackwood has been systematically falsifying records to cover the sale of cattle he later reports as stolen." She handed the photographs to Judge Hammond, who examined them with growing interest. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, "I have evidence that Mr. Morrison is not Mr. Blackwood's first victim. He has used similar tactics to drive out competitors throughout this territory." "This is preposterous," Marcus snarled. "Your Honor, this woman is a desperate spinster trying to save her last chance at marriage. Her accusations are the fantasies of a deranged mind." Victoria turned to face him fully, and in that moment, every person in the courtroom saw her as she truly was, not plain or desperate, but magnificent in her righteous fury. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "you are quite right about one thing. I am desperate, but not for marriage or security or social acceptance. I am desperate for justice in a world where men like you believe power gives you the right to destroy good people for profit." She turned back to Judge Hammond. "Your Honor, I submit that the evidence will show Mr. Blackwood not only falsely accused Mr. Morrison, but has been conducting a campaign of systematic fraud against the honest ranchers of this territory. The very cattle he claims were stolen were sold by him in Denver 3 days before he reported them missing." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hammond studied the photographs. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "Sheriff Cooper, I'm issuing a warrant for the immediate search of Mr. Blackwood's property and business records. These accusations, if proven true, constitute fraud on a scale that threatens the integrity of the entire territorial system." Marcus's face went white with rage and fear. For the first time since Victoria had known him, his carefully controlled mask had slipped, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. "You'll regret this," he hissed at Victoria. "All of you will regret this." But Victoria no longer feared his threats. Standing in that courtroom, surrounded by people she'd helped and who had come to help her in return, she realized she had found something she'd searched for her entire life: the courage to be exactly who she was meant to be. Regardless of who might disapprove, the battle was won. But Victoria knew the war for Willowbrook's future was just beginning. 6 months later, Victoria stood on the porch of the newly expanded schoolhouse, watching the spring wagon from Denver approach through the morning sunshine. Inside were 3 more teachers she had recruited from Eastern colleges, educated women, eager for adventure and a chance to shape young minds on the frontier. The Willowbrook Academy for Young Scholars, was about to welcome its largest class yet. The transformation of both the town and Victoria herself had been remarkable. Marcus Blackwood was serving 5 years in territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy. His vast holdings sold at auction to pay restitution to his victims. Daniel had used his share of the settlement to expand his ranch operations and invest in the school, creating a partnership that was thriving beyond either of their wildest dreams. But the most dramatic change was in Victoria herself. Gone was the hunched posture and apologetic manner of the woman who had stepped off the train in October. In her place stood someone who commanded respect through competence and kindness rather than demanding it through intimidation. Her height, once a source of shame, now gave her a commanding presence in any room. Her intelligence, formerly hidden or apologized for, had become the cornerstone of the Academy's reputation. "Mrs. Morrison," called a familiar voice. Victoria turned to see Miguel's oldest daughter, Elena, running toward her with a paper clutched in her small hands. At 8 years old, Elena was one of the Academy's star pupils, already reading at a level that would have been advanced for a 12-year-old. "What is it, sweetheart?" Victoria asked, kneeling to the girl's level. "I finished my composition about Colorado wildlife," Elena said proudly, her English now fluent, despite having spoken only Spanish when Victoria first met her. "Miss Mitchell says it's good enough to send to the Denver newspaper." Victoria examined the carefully written pages, noting Elena's precise observations about local bird species and their migration patterns. The girl had a natural scientist's mind, and Victoria was already planning advanced studies that would nurture that gift. "This is exceptional work, Elena. I'm very proud of you." The girl beamed and ran off to share her success with her parents. Victoria watched her go, remembering the frightened child who had clung to her mother's skirts after the fire. Education had given Elena confidence and opened doors to possibilities her parents had never imagined. "Admiring your handiwork?" Daniel's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and pride. Victoria turned to greet her husband of 4 months. Their wedding had been the social event of the year for Willowbrook, with families traveling from across the territory to celebrate. But more than the ceremony itself, Victoria treasured the quiet moments like this, when they could appreciate what they'd built together. "Our handiwork," she corrected, accepting his kiss on her cheek. "How did the meeting with the cattle buyers go?" "Better than expected. The new rail spur will be completed by fall, which means we can ship directly to eastern markets without the Denver middlemen taking their cut." Daniel's face showed the satisfaction of a man whose hard work was finally paying off. "Between the ranch profits and the Academy's success, we'll be able to expand both operations significantly." The Academy had exceeded every projection. What had started as Victoria's desperate plan to save the local school had evolved into a prestigious institution attracting students from across Colorado territory and beyond. Parents were willing to pay premium tuition for their children to receive the kind of comprehensive education that Victoria and her carefully selected faculty provided. They offered not just traditional subjects, but practical skills needed for frontier life, modern languages, natural sciences, and even basic business principles. Victoria had insisted that girls receive the same rigorous education as boys, a radical approach that had initially caused some controversy but ultimately attracted progressive families who wanted their daughters prepared for a changing world. "Speaking of expansion," Daniel continued, "I had an interesting conversation with Governor Evans when he visited last week. He's talking about establishing a teachers' college here in Willowbrook, with you as the founding principal." Victoria's breath caught. A teachers' college would mean training the next generation of educators, spreading their educational philosophy throughout the West. It was an opportunity beyond anything she had dared imagine during those dark days. "In Boston, what did you tell him?" "That I'd discuss it with my brilliant wife and let him know," Daniel smiled. "But I think we both know what your answer will be." Before Victoria could respond, Anna appeared around the corner of the building, leading a group of visitors. Victoria recognized several territorial officials, including Judge Hammond, who had presided over Marcus Blackwood's trial. Victoria. "These gentlemen would like to tour the academy," Anna announced. Judge Hammond was telling them about our innovative curriculum. Victoria smoothed her skirts and straightened her shoulders, unconsciously assuming the posture of authority that had become second nature. "Gentlemen, welcome to Willowbrook Academy. I'd be delighted to show you our facilities." The tour took 2 hours. Victoria led them through classrooms where children from 6 to 16 worked on everything from basic arithmetic to advanced Latin translation. They observed Anna teaching a natural philosophy lesson using specimens the children had collected themselves, watched older students conducting a mock territorial legislature, and marveled at the library that Victoria had built through donations and careful purchasing. "Remarkable," Judge Hammond commented as they concluded the tour in Victoria's office. "I've visited academies in Boston and Philadelphia that don't provide education this comprehensive." "Our students' needs are comprehensive," Victoria replied. "They must be prepared for a world that's changing rapidly. Basic literacy isn't sufficient anymore. They need critical thinking skills, scientific understanding, and the confidence to adapt to whatever challenges they might face." One of the other officials, a portly man with impressive whiskers, leaned forward in his chair. "Mrs. Morrison, I must ask, how do you justify providing the same advanced education to girls? As boys, surely their domestic duties require different preparation." Victoria had answered this question countless times, but she never grew tired of challenging such assumptions. "Sir, if a young woman inherits her family's ranch, as many do in the territories, shouldn't she understand mathematics well enough to manage the accounts? If she's called upon to teach her children, shouldn't she be educated enough to do so effectively? And if she has the intellectual gifts to become a doctor or lawyer, why should society waste such talents simply because of her gender?" The official looked uncomfortable, but Judge Hammond nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Morrison raises valid points. The frontier has always required women to take on responsibilities that Eastern society might consider inappropriate. Perhaps our educational systems should reflect those realities." After the visitors departed, Victoria found herself alone in her office as evening shadows lengthened across the mountains. The room reflected the journey she'd traveled. Her father's books now shared shelf space with modern educational texts. Her mother's silver brush sat beside correspondence from educators across the nation, and the walls displayed letters from former students who had gone on to universities and successful careers. She picked up a letter that had arrived that morning from Boston. The return address bore the name of her former headmistress, the woman who had relegated Victoria to teaching only the youngest children because parents found her appearance disturbing. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," the letter read, "I hope this correspondence finds you well. I am writing to inquire whether you might consider returning to Boston to establish a branch of your academy here. Several prominent families have heard remarkable reports about your educational methods and would welcome the opportunity to enroll their daughters in such a program. The position would come with significant financial compensation and social recognition." Victoria set the letter aside without finishing it. The irony was perfect. The same society that had rejected her as worthless now wanted to benefit from the strength and wisdom that rejection had forged. But she had no interest in returning to a world that measured worth by conventional beauty or social conformity. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of tea and wearing the expression of a man who knew his wife well enough to recognize when she needed quiet support. "Difficult day?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Illuminating day," Victoria corrected. Judge Hammond confirmed that the territorial legislature is likely to approve funding for the teachers' college. "And I received an offer to return to Boston." Daniel's eyebrows rose. And I realized how completely my life has changed. 6 months ago, such an offer would have seemed like vindication, proof that I had finally achieved something worthy of recognition. Now it seems irrelevant. Victoria gestured toward the window, where the lights of Willowbrook twinkled in. The gathering dusk, everything that matters to me is here. Including me? Daniel asked with a smile that made her heart flutter even after months of marriage. Especially you. Victoria rose and moved to the window, Daniel joining her there. Do you know what I was thinking about today? Tell me. That woman who stepped off the train last October, scared, desperate, convinced she was too ugly and awkward for anyone to love. I barely recognize her anymore. Daniel slipped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. I recognize her. She's the same woman who saw Miguel's family in need and immediately took charge. The same woman who defied Marcus Blackwood in open court. The same woman who built all this from nothing but determination and intelligence. You saw all that in someone who considered herself a failure. I saw someone who had been told she was a failure by people too limited to recognize her worth, Daniel corrected. There's a difference. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their community settle into evening routines. Children hurried home from late play. Shopkeepers closed their businesses. Families gathered for dinner in houses lit by warm lamplight. This was the life Victoria had helped create, not just for herself, but for everyone who called Willowbrook home. I have something for you, Daniel said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small wrapped package and placed it in her hands. Victoria unwrapped it carefully, revealing a silver locket engraved with the image of the academy building. Inside, she found a miniature photograph of their wedding day and a tiny pressed flower from her first day in Willowbrook. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's a reminder, Daniel said, of how far you've come, how much you've achieved, and how many lives you've changed for the better. As Victoria fastened the locket around her neck, she thought about the letter from Boston waiting on her desk. Tomorrow she would write her reply, polite but firm in declining their offer. She had found something more valuable than social recognition or financial success. She had found her purpose, her place, and most importantly, herself. The mail-order bride, who had thought herself too ugly for love, had become the belle of the territory, not through conventional beauty, but through the inner radiance that came from living authentically and serving something greater than herself. She had learned that true beauty lay not in meeting other people's expectations, but in exceeding her own. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. Victoria Morrison had found her foundation, and upon it, she would continue building a legacy that would outlast any individual life, a legacy of education, opportunity, and the revolutionary idea that every person, regardless of appearance or background, possessed unlimited potential waiting to be discovered and nurtured. In Willowbrook, under the vast Colorado sky, Victoria had finally found her home. 2 years had passed since Victoria's dramatic courtroom confrontation with Marcus Blackwood, and the autumn of 1887 brought changes to Willowbrook that no one could have predicted. Victoria stood at the window of her expanded office in what was now officially known as the Morrison Institute for Advanced Learning, watching the construction crews putting finishing touches on the new dormitory building. The growth had been so rapid it sometimes left her breathless. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a small-town school now educated over 200 students from across the American West. But with success had come challenges Victoria never anticipated, and a test that would prove whether the foundation she'd built could withstand the storms of a changing world. Victoria? Anna's voice carried a note of concern as she entered the office. In her hands was a telegram that made Victoria's stomach clench with dread. This just arrived from the territorial governor. Victoria read the message twice, her heart sinking with each word. The federal government was implementing new regulations for territorial schools, requiring all institutions to conform to standardized curricula developed in Washington. The progressive teaching methods Victoria had pioneered, the equal education for girls, the practical applications of learning, the integration of different cultural perspectives, all of it would have to be abandoned in favor of rigid, traditional approaches. They want us to separate the boys and girls into different programs, Anna said, her voice tight with anger. Domestic arts for the girls, classical studies for the boys only. And they're demanding we dismiss any teachers who don't meet their new certification requirements. Victoria felt a familiar surge of the fighting spirit that had sustained her through every crisis. Over my dead body. Victoria, be realistic. If we don't comply, they'll revoke our charter. We'll lose our funding, our accreditation, everything we've built. Then we'll build something new. Victoria's voice was calm but steel-hard with determination. Something they can't control or diminish. That evening, Victoria called an emergency meeting of the school's board of trustees, a group that now included Daniel, several prominent ranchers, the mayor of Willowbrook, and surprisingly, 2 women whose voices carried significant weight in territorial politics. The meeting was held in the Institute's main hall, beneath portraits of graduating classes that represented Victoria's proudest achievements. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria began, standing tall before the assembled group, we face a choice that will determine not just the future of our institution, but the future of education throughout the American West. She outlined the government's demands, watching as faces around the room reflected her own dismay and anger. When she finished, the room erupted in heated discussion. We have to comply, argued Henry Patterson, the bank president. We can't risk losing federal recognition. Compliance means betraying everything we stand for, countered Margaret Steinberg, one of the territory's first female lawyers and a fierce advocate for women's rights. Victoria, you've proven that girls can master any subject. We can't take that away from them now. Daniel spoke up from his seat near the front. What alternative do we have? If we lose our charter, we lose everything. Victoria raised her hand for silence. We have an alternative that requires courage, but it's entirely possible. We become a private institution, completely independent of government oversight. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. No federal funding, no territorial support, complete reliance on tuition and private donations. It would mean starting over, Victoria continued. Building our own accreditation, creating our own standards, proving ourselves without any official backing. But it would also mean freedom to educate our students according to what they need, not what bureaucrats in Washington think they should learn. Judge Williams, now retired but still influential, leaned forward in his chair. Victoria, that's an enormous risk. What if families won't pay tuition to an unaccredited school? Then we'll prove our worth through results, Victoria replied. Our graduates are already attending universities throughout the country. Harvard, Yale, Columbia. They all accept our students because they're better prepared than most. Let our success speak for itself. The debate continued for hours. Some board members urged caution. Others supported Victoria's bold vision. Finally, Margaret Steinberg called for a vote. All in favor of withdrawing from territorial oversight and establishing the Morrison Institute as a fully independent institution? Victoria held her breath as hands rose around the room. When the count was finished, the vote was 9 in favor, 3 opposed. They would make the leap into complete independence. But Victoria's challenges were far from over. Within days of announcing their decision, a campaign of intimidation began. Anonymous letters arrived threatening donors. Newspapers in Denver published articles questioning Victoria's qualifications and suggesting the institute was promoting dangerous radical ideas. Several families withdrew their children, fearful of association with an experimental school. The most serious blow came from an unexpected source. Theodore Blackwood, Marcus's cousin from Boston and the same man who had rejected Victoria years ago, arrived in Willowbrook with a team of Eastern investors. They announced plans to establish a proper boarding school that would provide traditional values and appropriate gender-specific education. "We're offering parents a choice," Theodore announced at a public meeting in the town hall, "between the questionable experiments of an unqualified woman and the proven methods of established Eastern institutions." Victoria sat in the audience, listening to the man who had once dismissed her as too scholarly, now using her very qualifications as weapons against her. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. When Theodore finished his presentation, Victoria rose from her seat. The room fell silent as she walked to the front, every eye upon her. She had learned to use her height and presence as tools of authority, and now she stood before the crowd with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, "you speak of proven methods. Tell me, what do your proven methods produce? Young women trained only to be ornamental? Young men educated to repeat what they've memorized rather than think for themselves?" Theodore's face flushed red. "Traditional education has served society well for centuries. Has it?" Victoria asked. "Has it served the young women told there, incapable of understanding mathematics? Has it served the immigrant children taught that their heritage is worthless? Has it served the frontier families whose children need practical skills as much as classical learning?" She turned to address the audience directly. "I stand before you as living proof that traditional education fails when it limits human potential. 7 years ago, I came to this territory as a rejected mail-order bride, considered too ugly and too educated for polite society. Today, I run an institution that prepares students for the world they'll actually live in, not the world their grandparents inhabited." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Victoria had spent years building relationships with these families, proving herself through results rather than promises. "Mr. Blackwood offers you the past," she continued. "I offer you the future. A future where your daughters can become doctors, lawyers, scientists, or anything else they have the ability to achieve. A future where your sons learn to think critically and adapt to change rather than simply memorizing Latin conjugations." Elena Guerrero, now 10 years old and one of Victoria's star pupils, stood up in the audience. "Mrs. Morrison taught me I could be anything," she said in clear, confident English. "Mr. Blackwood's school would teach me to be ashamed of speaking Spanish and proud of knowing nothing but sewing." Other students began standing throughout the hall, sharing their own testimonies. Parents spoke about children who had blossomed under Victoria's teaching, who had gained confidence and ambition they never would have discovered in traditional classrooms. When the meeting ended, it was clear that Willowbrook stood firmly behind Victoria. But the real test came 3 months later, when college acceptance letters began arriving for the Institute's graduating class. Victoria gathered the seniors in the main hall to announce the results. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the papers. The future of everything she'd built might depend on these letters. "Margaret Chen," she announced, "accepted to Stanford University with a full scholarship for engineering." Applause erupted. Margaret was the daughter of Chinese immigrants, a brilliant mathematician who would have been denied any advanced education under traditional systems. James Harrison accepted to Harvard Medical School. More applause. James had arrived as a struggling ranch hand son with barely functional literacy. Now he would become a doctor. Elena Guerrero accepted to Wellesley College for classical studies. The applause was thunderous. Elena's journey from Spanish-speaking immigrant child to college-bound scholar embodied everything Victoria had fought to achieve. As Victoria continued reading acceptances to Columbia, Yale, the University of Chicago, and other prestigious institutions, She realized they had won more than just an educational battle. They had proven that excellence could emerge from anywhere when nurtured with skill and love. That evening, as Victoria and Daniel sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The scared, desperate woman who had stepped off the train in Willowbrook seemed like someone from another lifetime. Any regrets? Daniel asked, perhaps reading her thoughts. Victoria considered the question seriously. About leaving Boston? About becoming a mail-order bride? About fighting the territorial government? She shook her head. None. Every rejection, every hardship, every battle led me here. Led me to you, to this community, to work that matters. Even the pain, especially the pain. It taught me that my worth isn't determined by other people's limitations. It showed me that being different isn't a flaw to be hidden, it's a strength to be celebrated. A month later, the Morrison Institute received its ultimate validation. The University of Colorado invited Victoria to establish a teacher training program that would spread her methods throughout the Western Territories. Eastern colleges began sending observers to study her techniques. The federal government, quietly abandoning their rigid requirements, asked if she would consider consulting on educational reform. Victoria declined the government position but accepted the university partnership. She had learned that true change came not from working within broken systems, but from building new ones that couldn't be constrained by old limitations. On a crisp October morning, exactly 7 years after her arrival in Willowbrook, Victoria stood once again on the train platform. But this time, she wasn't a desperate woman fleeing rejection. She was a confident leader boarding a train to Denver, where she would address the Western Territories Education Conference about the revolutionary idea that every child, regardless of gender, background, or appearance, deserved the chance to reach their full potential. As the train pulled away from Willowbrook, Victoria looked back at the town that had transformed her life. The Institute's buildings gleamed in the morning sun, filled with students from across the continent. The town itself had grown and prospered, attracting families who wanted the best education for their children. But Victoria's greatest pride wasn't in the buildings or the accolades. It was in the young people she'd watched discover their own strength and potential. Students like Elena, who had learned that her heritage was a treasure, not a burden. Like Margaret, who had proven that brilliance had no gender. Like James, who had discovered that poverty didn't have to define possibility. The mail-order bride who had thought herself too ugly for love had become something far more powerful, a woman who helped others discover their own beauty, strength, and worth. In teaching them to see past society's limitations, she had learned to see past her own. The legacy she was building would outlast any individual life. In every student who refused to accept artificial limits, in every teacher who saw potential instead of problems, in every parent who demanded better for their children, Victoria's revolution would continue. She had found her true calling, not as someone's wife or society's ideal, but as herself, fully and authentically, and in embracing that truth, she had given others permission to do the same. The train carried her toward new challenges and opportunities, but Victoria no longer feared the unknown. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear, to build despite obstacles, to love despite rejection. The woman who had once hidden her intelligence now used it to transform society. The woman who had once apologized for her height now stood tall as a beacon for others. The woman who had once thought herself unlovable had discovered that the deepest love came from accepting herself exactly as she was and becoming the Belle of the territory. Victoria had learned the most important truth of all. Real beauty radiates from within, shining brightest when it serves something greater than itself. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, its yellow paper trembling in Victoria's hands as she read the devastating news. Daniel had collapsed at the railway station in Denver, where he'd gone to negotiate new shipping contracts for the ranch. The doctors were calling it a severe heart episode, and they weren't certain he would survive the night. Victoria stared at the words until they blurred, her mind refusing to accept their meaning. In 8 years of marriage, Daniel had been her anchor, her partner in every dream and challenge. The thought of losing him felt like contemplating the loss of half her soul. "Mrs. Morrison?" Anna's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's happened?" Victoria handed her the telegram without speaking, then moved mechanically to her desk to begin making arrangements. The next train to Denver wouldn't leave until evening. 8 hours of not knowing, of imagining the worst, of facing the possibility that everything she'd built might crumble without the man who'd helped make it possible. "I'll handle everything here," Anna said immediately. "The institute, the ranch, operations, all of it. You just focus on Daniel." The train journey to Denver lasted 14 agonizing hours. Victoria sat rigid in her seat, watching the familiar Colorado landscape rush past while her mind conjured every terrible scenario. She thought of their last conversation, a mundane discussion about spring planting schedules. Had she told him she loved him? Had she made clear how much their partnership meant to her? Presbyterian Hospital in Denver was the imposing brick building that smelled of carbolic acid and sorrow. Victoria's heels echoed in the empty corridors as a nurse led her to Daniel's room. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her strong, capable husband lying pale and still among the white sheets, connected to mysterious medical apparatus. "Mrs. Morrison?" The doctor, a young man with kind eyes, approached her carefully. "I'm Dr. Patterson. Your husband suffered what we call an apoplectic episode of the heart. The next 48 hours will be critical." Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. She pulled a chair close to Daniel's bed and took his hand, noting how cold his fingers felt. This was the hand that had helped her down from countless wagons, that had written love letters during their courtship, that had applauded every student graduation at the institute. "Can he hear me?" she whispered. "We believe so. Talk to him." Sometimes familiar voices can help guide patients back. So Victoria talked. She told Daniel about the institute's latest news, about Elena's acceptance to graduate school, about the new dormitory construction. She read him letters from former students, shared gossip from Willowbrook, described the spring flowers beginning to bloom in their garden. On the second day, when Daniel's condition remained unchanged, Victoria received an unexpected visitor. Judge Hammond entered the hospital room, his usually stern expression softened with genuine concern. "Victoria, I came as soon as I heard. How is he?" "The same," Victoria replied, her voice hoarse from hours of talking to an unresponsive man. "The doctors say it could go either way." Judge Hammond sat heavily in the spare chair. "I need to discuss something with you, though I hate bringing business matters at a time like this." Victoria looked at him with tired eyes. "What is it?" "There are rumors circulating about the Institute's future. Word has gotten out about Daniel's condition, and some people are speculating that without his financial support and business expertise, the school might not survive." "The Institute is financially sound," Victoria said automatically, though a new fear began gnawing at her chest. "We have endowments, tuition revenue. You have those things as long as confidence remains high." Judge Hammond interrupted gently. "But several major donors are already expressing concerns, and there are people who would like to see your educational experiment fail." Victoria felt the weight of another crisis settling on her shoulders. It wasn't enough that she might lose her husband. Now she faced the possibility of losing everything they'd built together. "Furthermore," Judge Hammond continued, "there are legal complications. The ranch, the institute buildings, most of your joint assets are held in Daniel's name. If the worst happens, you could face significant challenges in maintaining control." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Victoria. As a woman in 1889, even her own accomplishments were legally tied to her husband's ownership. Without Daniel, she might find herself fighting not just for the Institute's survival, but for her right to continue the work that had become her life's purpose. That evening, as Victoria maintained her vigil beside Daniel's bed, she made a decision. That would have seemed impossible to the frightened mail-order bride who had arrived in Willowbrook 9 years earlier. She would not wait for others to determine her fate. "Daniel," she said, squeezing his hand, "I need you to fight. But if you can't, I want you to know that I'll protect everything we built. I won't let them take it away." Over the next week, while Daniel's condition slowly stabilized, Victoria began implementing a plan that surprised everyone who thought they knew her limitations. Using her network of former students and progressive allies, she quietly began restructuring the Institute's legal foundations. Margaret Steinberg, the female lawyer who had been one of Victoria's earliest supporters, worked around the clock to establish new legal protections. Elena Guerrero, now accomplished scholar in her own right, helped coordinate communications with supporters across the territory. Former students contributed both funds and influence, creating a network of protection that transcended traditional power structures. Most importantly, Victoria discovered that her years of building relationships and proving her competence had created something she'd never fully recognized: real political power. When Theodore Blackwood attempted to capitalize on the crisis by spreading rumors about the Institute's impending collapse, he found himself facing opposition from unexpected quarters. The mayor of Denver publicly endorsed Victoria's leadership. University presidents from California to Massachusetts sent letters of support. Even territorial legislators, normally conservative on women's issues, rallied to defend an institution that had brought prestige to Colorado. "You've become more influential than you realize," Judge Hammond told Victoria as they reviewed the legal documents that would protect her work. "People don't just respect your educational methods anymore, they respect you." When Daniel finally opened his eyes on the 10th day, the first thing he saw was Victoria's face, thinner from worry, but radiant with relief. The first words he spoke were her name. "I'm here," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm here, and everything's going to be all right. The ranch... the Institute... Daniel's voice was weak but concerned. "Thriving," Victoria assured him. "We've made some changes, restructured some things, but everything we built is safe." As Daniel's strength slowly returned over the following weeks, Victoria shared the details of what she'd accomplished during his illness. The legal protections, the expanded support network, the transformation of the Institute from a husband and wife partnership into something larger and more permanent. "You've made us stronger," Daniel said one afternoon as they sat in the hospital's garden, spring sunshine warming their faces. "I'm proud of you." "We made us stronger," Victoria corrected. "Your illness showed me that our work is bigger than either of us individually. It belongs to everyone we've touched, everyone we've taught, everyone who believes in what we're doing." The return journey to Willowbrook felt like a homecoming unlike any Victoria had experienced. The entire community turned out to welcome Daniel home, but Victoria noticed something different in how people looked at her. The crisis had revealed her as more than just Daniel's capable wife. She was a leader in her own right. That evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the familiar sunset paint the mountains gold, Victoria reflected on how much had changed. The scared woman who had once believed her worth depended on others' approval had discovered her own power to shape the world. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, noting her contemplative mood. "How different everything is from when I first arrived here," Victoria replied. "I thought I was coming to find someone who might accept me despite my flaws. Instead, I found myself." "And what did you find?" Victoria smiled, her hand finding his in the gathering twilight. "That I was never broken in the first place. I was just waiting for the right place to bloom. The greatest test hadn't been surviving. Daniel's illness or protecting the Institute from those who wanted to see it fail. The greatest test had been learning to trust in her own strength, to lead without apology, and to understand that the woman who had once thought herself too ugly for love had become someone whose inner beauty inspired others to reach heights they'd never imagined possible. In saving what they'd built together, Victoria had discovered that she was capable of far more than she'd ever dared to dream. The carriage wheels crunched over the familiar gravel drive as Victoria and Daniel returned home from Denver for what would be the last time as private citizens of Willowbrook. Tomorrow, Victoria would be sworn in as Colorado's first female territorial education commissioner, a position created specifically for her after her unprecedented success in transforming frontier education. As they approached their house, Victoria gasped in amazement. The entire front yard was filled with people. Students, parents, teachers, ranchers, shop owners, even families who had traveled hundreds of miles to be here. Colorful banners stretched between the trees, and someone had constructed a small stage decorated with wildflowers and autumn leaves. "Surprise!" called Anna, rushing forward to embrace her mentor and dearest friend. "We couldn't let you accept this appointment without a proper celebration." Victoria stepped down from the carriage, overwhelmed by the sea of faces, so many lives she had touched, so many people who had become part of her extended family. Elena Guerrera, now Dr. Guerrera and the first Latina physician in Colorado Territory, stood proudly with her young daughter. Margaret Chun had returned from California with her engineering degree, ready to help build the railroad lines that would connect remote communities to educational opportunities. "Speech! Speech!" called out Tommy Henderson, the boy who had once struggled with Latin conjugations and was now a respected lawyer in Denver. Victoria felt Daniel's steady hand on her arm as he helped her onto the small stage. Looking out at the crowd, she saw faces that represented every stage of her journey in Colorado, from Miguel's family, whom she'd helped during their first crisis, to recent graduates heading off to universities across the nation. "My dear friends," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "When I stepped off that train 10 years ago, I thought I was coming here to find someone who might accept me despite my flaws. I never imagined I would find a community that would help me discover I was never flawed at all." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Victoria noticed several people wiping their eyes, including tough ranchers who weren't known for showing emotion. "I was told I was too tall, too plain, too educated for any man to want me. Boston society had decided my worth, and I had accepted their judgment." Victoria paused, remembering that broken woman with something approaching fond pity. "But Willowbrook taught me that true beauty isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about exceeding your own." She gestured toward the school buildings visible in the distance, their windows golden in the afternoon sun. "Together, we built something that changed not just individual lives, but the entire concept of what education could be in the American West. We proved that every child, regardless of gender, background, or family circumstances, deserves the chance to reach their full potential." Elena's daughter, Isabella, stepped forward from the crowd. At 8 years old, she already spoke 3 languages fluently and was studying mathematics at a level that would have been considered advanced for a teenage boy just a generation earlier. "Mrs. Morrison," Isabella said in clear, confident voice, "my mama says you taught her that being different isn't something to hide. You taught her that being smart was something to be proud of." Victoria knelt down to meet the child's eyes. "And what did your mama teach you?" "That I can be anything I want to be," Isabella replied without hesitation. "A doctor like her, or an engineer like Miss Chun, or a teacher like Miss Mitchell, or maybe something nobody's ever been before." The crowd applauded, but Victoria felt something deeper than approval in their response. She felt the profound satisfaction of a mission accomplished, a legacy secured, a future made brighter. "That," Victoria said, standing and addressing the crowd again, is what real education accomplishes. It doesn't just teach facts or skills. It teaches people to believe in possibilities they never knew existed. As the celebration continued into the evening with music and dancing and storytelling, Victoria found quiet moments to speak privately with individuals who had shaped her journey. Mrs. Jenkins, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, reminisced about the scared young woman who had arrived at her boarding house. "You know what I remember most about those first days?" Mrs. Jenkins said as they sat together on the porch swing. "It wasn't how plain you thought you were, or how scared you seemed. It was how you looked at little Miguel's children when they needed help. Your whole face changed. You forgot to be afraid because something else needed your attention." Sheriff Cooper, long retired but still a respected voice in the community, shared his perspective on Victoria's transformation. "I've seen a lot of people come and go in this territory," he said, "but I've never seen anyone grow into themselves the way you did. You didn't just change, you became who you were always meant to be." As the night deepened and the celebration began to wind down, Victoria found herself standing with Daniel at the edge of the crowd, watching their friends and neighbors saying their goodbyes. The scene felt like a perfect encapsulation of the community they had helped create. Diverse, supportive, full of people who had learned to see past surface differences to the strength beneath any second thoughts about accepting the commissioner position. Daniel asked. Victoria considered the question seriously. The appointment would mean traveling throughout the territory, establishing new schools, training teachers, fighting bureaucratic battles on a much larger scale. It would be challenging, demanding, sometimes frustrating work. "None," she said finally. "This is what I was meant to do. What we were meant to do together." "Together?" Victoria smiled, taking his hand. "Did you really think I'd let you stay here managing the ranch while I traveled around reforming territorial education? We're partners, Daniel Morrison. That doesn't change just because I have a fancy new title." As they walked back toward their house, passing under banners that proclaimed, "Congratulations, Commissioner Morrison," and the Belle of the territory, Victoria marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The rejected mail order bride had become a woman whose influence would shape education throughout the American West. But more than the titles or recognition, Victoria treasured the deeper transformation. She had learned to see herself not through others' eyes, but through her own. She had discovered that real beauty came from authenticity, real strength from service to others, and real love from accepting herself exactly as she was. The house felt wonderfully quiet after the day's excitement. As Victoria prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, the same mirror where she had once seen only flaws and disappointments. The woman looking back was older now, with silver threading through her brown hair and lines around her eyes from years of smiling. Her height, once a source of shame, now conveyed dignity and authority. Her serious expression, once considered off-putting, now reflected wisdom and compassion. "Beautiful," Daniel said softly, appearing behind her in the mirror's reflection. "Finally," Victoria replied, and meant it. The next morning, as Victoria prepared to take the oath that would make her Colorado's first female education commissioner, she thought about the young woman who had written that desperate letter to a stranger 10 years ago. That woman had believed she was settling for whatever scraps of acceptance she could find. She had no idea she was embarking on a journey that would make her one of the most influential women in the American West. Standing before the territorial governor and a crowd of dignitaries, Victoria raised her right hand and swore to uphold the principles of equal education for all. But silently, she made another vow: to continue fighting for every child who had ever been told they were too different, too poor, too ambitious for their own good. The mail-order bride who had thought herself too ugly for love had discovered something far more valuable than conventional beauty. She had found her purpose, her voice, and her power to change the world. In becoming the Belle of the territory, Victoria Morrison had learned the most important lesson of all. True beauty isn't about being perfect. It's about being perfectly, authentically yourself, and using that authenticity to lift others up. The rejected woman had become the architect of transformation, not just for herself, but for generations of students who would benefit from her revolutionary belief that every person, regardless of appearance or background, possessed unlimited potential waiting to be discovered and nurtured. The story that began with heartbreak had become a testament to the extraordinary things that could happen when someone refused to accept society's limitations and dared to write their own ending instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.